Now, you can be honest with me. Does anyone here find the idea of transfiguration that we heard in that story that Tony read to be maybe a little confusing? I know that I do, at least. But Cindy Bourgeois, who is a trans theologian and a good friend of mine from my time in seminary, once preached that in transfiguration, it might not be that a person really changes at all. Instead, maybe what changes is how they are perceived and known by others. Perhaps they are finally seen for who they truly are. Now, it might be the observers who change or the community that changes through this experience. In transfiguration, maybe we finally perceive what is really real, the core, the essence, maybe what has always been true. I'm not sure if Jesus changed in the transfiguration or if instead the disciples finally saw a glimpse of who he was, who he had always been. The stories of Jesus we know, are so filled with paradox. Those who were closest to him, like his disciples, seem again and again to really not get him, not understand anything about who he is. But instead, it is outsiders and strangers who do. Going back to Jesus' birth, back to Christmas, if you can remember back to that, it is the lowly shepherds and wise people from far away who are some of the first to recognize him. Later on in his ministry, it's marginalized racial and gender minorities. People like the Syrophoenician woman who see straight into the core of who he is, what he can do, and demand that he rise to that calling. And I think maybe that's often the way. Sometimes, perhaps, we take for granted those who are closest to us, people we might think we know everything about, people like our parents or our children or our closest friends. They may be, in fact, so close to us that we can't see them for who they truly are. But sometimes, strangers and outsiders can give us a new experience, a new perspective, even on these most familiar folks. Like the outsiders in Jesus' life, sometimes those with some distance have greater perspective. And I think the same can go for our relationship to places in addition to people. For example, I find it interesting to talk to some youth, as a person who didn't grow up in the Bay Area, to talk to youth who did grow up right here in the Bay Area. Many of them seem to dream about moving to other places. Some tell me, yeah, California is fine, but did you know you can buy a whole house with a 2-car garage and a swimming pool for only $100,000 in North Dakota? Now, I don't mean to disparage any place or any dream, but just to say maybe sometimes we take for granted what we have. I think church can be like that too, a place that is so familiar to some of us. Now, I grew up going to church, but as a child, I must say I took it a bit for granted. To be honest, for me personally, I was a bit more into ancient Egypt than ancient Palestine. I thought that biblical stories were, dare I say, a little bit lacking in the wonders of buried gold and curses and especially mummified organs in jars. But then, how I saw the church changed completely when I was a teenager. Now, the church itself didn't change, but how I saw it did. And maybe I had just enough distance from the church to be able to see it in that new perspective, in new light. I credit a lot of that change to a kind and feisty theological student who did an internship at my church. She showed me the intersection of faith and justice, bringing me with her to peace vigils and protests, teaching me how faith and justice are two wings of one bird. I didn't have just one mountaintop experience, but for me, it was a steady climb up and into the life of faith in action. My church and so many other progressive churches, I definitely include CCSM in that, had been there churching along for decades, for generations, but suddenly I got it. And more than getting it, I loved it. At age 14, I was leading the middle school youth group. At 16, I was on the church board. And at 18, only 18, I was elected to serve on our denomination's national executive. So many committees, it sounds a bit like church, right? So then, at age 18, I went off to university, ready to prepare for ministry and give my life to the church that had gifted much life to me. But as I began my term in denominational leadership, I must say my sort of church honeymoon period came tumbling to a close. Tumbling down from the mountaintop of spirituality and justice-rooted sacred community, off the cliff into cutbacks and mergers, restructuring, with the social justice work seemingly at least more impacted than anything else. Now, it's not to say that the financial situation wasn't real, but sometimes when we're put to the test, our true values show. In serving the denomination, I learned about the incredible things that my church had done, like helping to facilitate peace talks between North and South Korea, also being willing to go against the advice of lawyers and risk bankruptcy for offering apologies for running Indigenous residential schools. As you may know, these so-called schools caused a multitude of horrific abuses that live on to this day through intergenerational trauma. Now, I should say apologies are certainly not enough, but they are a step. However, for me, it felt like I was learning about all this brave and important work that my church had done as I was part of the decisions to reduce or end it. It felt like all of the things that were bringing me into the church were simultaneously the very same things I saw disappearing right before my eyes. It was hard. As I was remembering this time in my life and preparing to preach today, I found solace in the reminder that the transfiguration story is what moves us into the season of Lent. That just as I experienced transfiguration in my understanding of the church, right as it was, in a way, dying, so too was it with Jesus. As Jesus comes down from the mountain, he tells his disciples that his death is coming soon. But his disciples are caught up in the here and now, the shine and the glimmer, perhaps blinded by their transcendent spiritual experience. They want to hold on to the moment, and they resist Jesus' reminder that he is going to die. Now, how better to hold on to a special moment than to build a monument, to write it down, to memorialize and preserve it? Do what is perhaps the ancient equivalent of engraving a commemorative plaque, or maybe one of those nice inscribed benches. Peter wants to build something to commemorate the transfiguration, and that's something sometimes referred to as a booth or a tent or a tabernacle, referencing the Jewish festival of tabernacles. I like that the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible refers to this thing as a dwelling place, something to stay safely within. Now, it's certainly not a new idea, and perhaps you've come across this yourself, to say that today's mainline church is a bit more of a monument than a movement. And some people even add mausoleum to this metaphor and suggest that we're maybe past both the movement and the monument phases. And there may be ways in which that is true. We do have a lot of order and structure, policies, and procedures. But I would add that many of those exist for good reason, to protect the most vulnerable, to ensure transparency, open participation, and so forth. I think it can be a cheap shot to critique monuments uncritically. I'm sure many of us know the problems that can arise in movements without structure, and especially without accountability. The story of Jesus' transfiguration is clearly meant to remind us of when Moses in Exodus went up a mountain to receive the Ten Commandments. Both this story of Moses and Jesus' transfiguration, there's a lot of similarities here. Period of 6 days, 3 companions, mountaintops, shining figures, and God speaking from a cloud. And both involve the construction of something afterward. Peter's 3 dwellings after Jesus' transfiguration, and in Exodus, we get the construction of both those tablets with the 10 Commandments and also the Ark of the Covenant. But it was interesting for me to reflect and think, well, actually, when Jesus was up on that mountaintop, not only were the 10 Commandments and the Ark of the Covenant built, but this was also the time of the creation of the golden calf. So perhaps the problem is not so much with construction, creating something tangible, but maybe, perhaps, what matters most is exactly what is being built. Is it an expression of our deepest values and beliefs, like the tablets with the 10 Commandments? Or is it an idol, like the golden calf? Maybe a better question to ask about is not whether we are a monument or a movement, but whether we are a monument or an idol. The word monument derives from the Latin word that means to remind. And I think we can build structures that remind and more so facilitate and support and give foundation and structure to embody our values. It's not to say we shouldn't also be a movement, but structure does not necessarily impede movement. In fact, it can make it possible. But we all know not all structures move. Not all monuments are living reminders. Some monuments can seemingly take on a life of their own. They can even get seduced into emulating other structures that are built to serve other missions, perhaps even becoming idols, serving other gods. A few years later, in my field education class in seminary, my classmates and I one day got on to lamenting what was then the latest round of budget cuts in the denomination. My classmates and I each realized that we were all there in seminary and felt called to serve the church because of one of those programs or policies that was being impacted or reduced. Things like national youth events, interfaith dialogue, global solidarity, and so forth. So that day in class, our incredible professor, Joan Wyatt, heard us and asked, so what can we do? You are all here because you had a mountaintop experience or you met God embodied in the church's witness for justice. What can we do to be faithful to that? We decided that a step we could take was to educate future church leaders about what was happening, and we petitioned our seminary to add a seminar about church funding and finance. We involved our ethics professor and visiting scholars from the Global South. We realized that so many of our classmates didn't even know how the church was funded, let alone about these cuts or the denomination's past commitments to justice and equity in finance. But in the end, we weren't able to stop those cuts. And one of the reasons that it seemed impossible to mobilize something was that every year our denomination printed these advertisements that celebrated we had met the funding goal for the year. Now, what wasn't said was that the denomination deliberately set that fundraising goal lower year by year. So they knew they would reach the goal, even though it wasn't enough to sustain the work. But they knew they would have a positive story to tell. Fundraising wisdom says that no one wants to give to a declining institution, not to mention a dying one. Now, this may seem a little strange, but the church, I believe, is in part a dying institution. Jesus reminds his disciples over and over that he is going to die and invites them to come walk alongside. The disciples, they don't want to, or maybe they can't hear that. They want to stay in the realm of the upbeat and the positive. They want to create monuments that are safe and comfortable. They want to stay on their mountaintop high rather than journeying with Jesus into Jerusalem. But we also know that Jesus' death is not the end of the story. Our tradition is one of parable and paradox, and over, we are reminded that the metrics of success we follow are different. That in weakness there can be strength, and that in serving we can be served. In being willing to risk death, we can find new life. that what matters most is not growth or size or positivity or anything but faithfulness. Now, it's important to say we do not or need not seek death for death's sake, but rather we are willing to risk and be seen as foolish or naive. We are called instead to let go or even let die all that does not serve, all that is entangled with idols and empire and violence and unearned, unjust privilege. So what is it that we are called to build in order that we may have monuments and movements that will serve to remind and remember, truly restore and bring back into membership, to resurrect and bring new life in and through our church? We are called into the life of Jesus, the path of service, the call to justice. I would say if those are alive, then the church is alive. If our monuments testify to that life, those mountaintop experiences of spiritual vibrancy, of the church being its best self, that's one thing. But if our monuments are idols, impediments to movements, mausoleums of injustice, they must go. Now, some of you will know I feel so strongly about this topic that it is, in part, what brought me here to California to go back to school after seminary and time in ministry to do a PhD, and now to write this book out this week. Thank you all for your support, to share my research with others. I feel called to testify to the moments when I have seen the church transfigured, serving vitally and transformatively in the world. I feel called and compelled to share what I have seen and what the church can be. And there are so many examples. I got to research a church in Pennsylvania that created a debt annihilation program where church members with credit card debt have come together in small groups to pay off one another's debts, starting with whoever's debt has the highest interest rate, and aided by funds from the church. There's a church in Washington, D.C. that launched a worker-owned cleaning cooperative, centering undocumented women who are now business owners in charge of setting their own wages and working conditions. There are churches working for reconciliation with indigenous peoples, giving back some of their church property to the original peoples of the land. Writing this book has been, in part, creating a monument to what has been and could be. And I hope and pray it is a moving monument that will inspire others to do this work too. I know this work of being the church and embodying God's call for justice isn't easy, and sometimes this work involves a great deal of struggle and even loss. But as we journey this week toward the season of Lent, we know the path of faith is not easy. But we can also trust that all death is not final. It is not always the end of the story. I believe we need not needlessly avoid mausoleums if they serve to remind us of the death and endings that are necessary. Endings can be a part of transfiguration. We must let go of what we thought we knew in order to see what truly is, to allow for what could be. So we prepare to enter this week into Lent, knowing it can be hard, a season without simple platitudes or any feel-good, upbeat, just positive thinking. It can be a time of letting go, of release, reclarification, and recommitment. It can be a time of seeing one another and the church transfigured, who we truly are and what, as a community, we are called to be. And we journey together. God is with us. We are not alone. We journey with Jesus, who has gone before and who goes with us now and always. For this and so much more, thanks be to God. Amen.